This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Counterfeit designer clothing, medicines, and other products are made and sold around the world. American investigators say the counterfeit goods industry is a bigger business than the illegal drug trade. And they say anyone buying such goods could be providing support to criminal activities. Counterfeit goods may look like the real thing, but they are copies made without the approval of the business or individual with rights to the original product. Many fake goods from East Asia enter the United States through the port of Los Angeles, California. People looking for low prices on goods go to a part of downtown Los Angeles called Santee Alley. It is a place where counterfeit goods are sold. Clothing, sunglasses, watches, and toys fill the many small stores in the area. Anita Gray has been going to Santee Alley for years. She says she would never buy fake designer products. She says she has seen them there, although not recently. Investigator Chris Buckner says there is a reason people do not see counterfeit goods openly displayed at Santee Alley anymore. Police have repeatedly raided stores that carry fake designer goods. As a result, people who sell them are much more careful. Chris Buckner says sellers will offer the fake goods to buyers and take them to a storage area where the goods are hidden. An estimated $500 billion is spent on counterfeit goods every year. Chris Buckner notes that local street gangs, organized crime groups, and even terrorists are involved in counterfeiting. At the Port of Los Angeles, police seize counterfeit clothing, prescription medications, electronics, and cigarettes. Investigators say large amounts of the fake and stolen designer products come from China and enter American ports in large shipping containers. More than 14 million shipping containers arrive in Los Angeles every year. Police are able to inspect less than 1% of them. Police say there are ways to tell if a product is counterfeit. Look at the kind of store where the product is sold and whether the price seems too low. If it is probably a fake. For VOA Special English, I'm Mario Ritter. To read, listen, and learn English, go to voaspecialenglish.com. You can also find our captioned videos at the VOA Learning English channel on YouTube.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Anyone who has ever borrowed money can relate to the debate over raising America's borrowing limit. People who have reached their limit can try to ask their bank to increase it and go deeper into debt. Or they can cut their spending and try to get their finances under control. Or they can do both. Either way, they have to keep paying their bills. If they default on their debt, that only makes it harder and costlier to borrow in the future. In July, President Obama and congressional leaders held hours of sometimes tense meetings at the White House. Opposition Republican leaders agreed on the need to raise the borrowing limit by August 2nd, or risk the nation's first default. The argument was over how to cut deficits. Most Republicans oppose any kind of tax increase. Most Democrats in Congress oppose big cuts in government spending, especially social programs for retirees and the poor. Jerry Webman is chief economist for Oppenheimer Funds, an investment company. He says the central issue is how the U.S. is going to bring its federal budget back down to a sustainable deficit level. He says the debate has deep roots in the Constitution. The Constitution was written by people who were very, very suspicious of executive authority and built into the Constitution lots of ways in which the three branches of government could check and balance each other. Those three branches represent the President, Congress, and the courts. Congress passed the first debt limit law in 1917. That was to control the costs of America's entry into World War I. Today, Jerry Webman says the United States is going through an important debate on what services Americans can expect from their government. He says, "I think we may be looking at one of those almost generational changes in the role of the federal government in U.S. society." Lenders worried about the risk of not getting repaid usually demand high interest rates. That has happened to heavily indebted countries such as Greece, Ireland, and Portugal. On July 14th, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke warned lawmakers that lack of action to raise the borrowing limit would mean a lower credit rating for the United States. The central banker said that means the government could have to pay sharply higher interest rates, and that would only add to deficits in what he called a self-inflicted wound. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Presutti. This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. A roller coaster ride is one description for the days of historic ups and downs in stock markets recently. If you want to use a more technical term, the markets have experienced volatility in a big way. Major measures of United States markets closed with their biggest one-day losses since the financial crisis of 2008. Asia and Europe also had sharp declines. Volatile markets can react suddenly in wild and unpredictable ways. Usually, some kind of shock, or more than one, is involved. For example, on August 5th, one of the three major credit rating agencies downgraded long-term United States government debt. Standard & Poor's lowered its opinion of Treasury securities one step from the highest rating, AAA, to AA+. But shocks like a hopeful jobs report or good earnings results can stop a fall and send prices higher. Also, when prices fall, investors may find good deals and start buying. The United States held S&P's top rating for 70 years and never had a downgrade. but many investors were expecting that to happen even after the budget deal in Washington. In early August, Congress agreed to increase the government's borrowing limit in return for steps to cut spending and reduce the deficit. S&P says it thinks America's debt will only increase in the future. President Obama disagreed, saying, "The fact is, we didn't need a rating agency to tell us that we need a balanced, long-term approach to deficit reduction." He said markets still consider United States credit as among the world's safest. Still, there have been growing worries of another recession, a double dip. On August 9th, policymakers at the central bank said economic growth so far this year has been considerably slower than they had expected. The Federal Reserve said it would likely keep short-term interest rates near zero for at least 2 more years. Borrowing costs for the United States remain very low, but debt worries in 2 of Europe's biggest economies have increased costs for their governments in recent weeks. On August 8th, the European Central Bank began buying debt securities from Spain and Italy. These efforts helped push down interest rates for those countries. But Europe must still deal with the rescues of Greece, Ireland, and Portugal. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Presutti. For more business news and to learn American English, go to voaspecialenglish.com.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. Detroit Mayor Dave Bing had to report some bad news recently. He said Detroit was seeking bankruptcy protection. The move would give the city court protection from creditors. The decision to declare bankruptcy is an effort to restructure and reduce debt. It comes at a difficult time for Detroit. In March, Michigan Governor Rick Snyder named Kevin Orr a bankruptcy expert to oversee the city's financial problems. Detroit has been struggling to reduce a budget deficit of more than $300 million. In addition, the city's long-term debt has increased to at least $18 billion. Detroit's problems have grown over many years. Michigan State University professor Eric Scorsone says the city depended too much on one industry, automobile manufacturing. Jobs with car makers were a big reason why Detroit was one of the country's largest cities half a century ago. In the 1950s, it had a population of about 1.8 million people. Today, the number is down to less than 800,000. Robin Boyle is a professor of urban planning at Wayne State University. He says over the years, many Detroit residents moved to areas outside the city or even left the state. That hurt Detroit's ability to invest in itself. It is rare for a large American city to seek bankruptcy protection. In 1975, New York City came close before the federal government agreed to provide money. Detroit, however, is the largest city to seek bankruptcy. Now, a federal judge is to consider Detroit's request. One of the main issues is what to do about the retirement pay of city workers. Currently, there are many more retired workers than those paying into the pension system. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal. I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Economics Report. At the end of December, publisher Merriam-Webster released its list of top 10 words of the year for 2010. Austerity was at the top. The company made its list based on how often people looked up definitions using its online dictionary. Merriam-Webster defines austerity as enforced or extreme economy. Greece and Ireland face huge budget deficits. This has forced severe spending cuts for those governments. And they are not alone. When nations get into financial trouble, they may request loans from the International Monetary Fund or other donors. Donors, however, demand austerity measures, such as sharp cuts in government spending and tax increases. Michael Izza is chief executive of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. He says the world financial crisis pushed some governments to spend more. But not all debt problems are the same. Economist Dev Carr says Greece got into trouble by having too many government employees spending freely on retirement pay and misleading investors. Last spring, Greece received rescue loans of over $100 billion. But Germany agreed to help only if Greece promised tough austerity measures. Ireland's budget deficits grew sharply after it guaranteed the bad loans of the country's biggest banks. In November, European officials agreed to a bailout nearly as large as the one Greece received. But austerity measures are unpopular. Large protests have taken place not only in Greece and Ireland, but also in Britain, Portugal, and Romania. Other nations facing big deficits and slow economic growth are also seeing their borrowing costs rise. Credit rating agencies are warning about the debts of Portugal and Spain, and others may follow. In May, European leaders agreed to set aside nearly $700 billion to help troubled countries in the area. But the chief of the International Monetary Fund, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, says a more organized approach is needed. He said, Europe has to provide a comprehensive solution to this problem. The piecemeal approach, one country after the other one, is not a good one. This could mean austerity will remain a top word for 2011. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You can find more economics reports at voaspecialenglish.com.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. In recent years, a shining city grew in the desert of Dubai, on and even off the Gulf Coast. An island shaped like a palm tree was built for hotels, homes, and entertainment. In October of 2008, the same developer announced plans for the world's tallest building yet. But the economic downturn soon forced the Nikhil company to suspend those plans. Dubai is in the United Arab Emirates, a 38-year-old federation of 7 territories ruled by emirs. But unlike its neighbor Abu Dhabi, oil has not fueled Dubai's growth. Oil is only 6% of its economy. Instead, the property and service industries have led its expansion. Now, Dubai finds itself in financial pain, and its reaction has some investors worried. In November, Dubai's largest investment company called for a 6-month delay in paying some of its debts. Dubai World Group is seeking to renegotiate terms on $26 billion in debt. All of it is linked to Nikhil, which is part of Dubai World. The government owns Dubai World and will take control of its restructuring. But Dubai's finance chief said the government does not guarantee its debt. Dubai World owes creditors a total of $60 billion. The company is not an investment vehicle for the government like a sovereign wealth fund. It is a holding company for businesses in land development, port operations, energy, and financial services. The group has used borrowed money for economic development. Giath Naqshbandi of American University in Washington notes that the problems are linked to a worldwide collapse in real estate prices. He says, emerging markets are as victim to the world meltdown as any other economy, and there are no exceptions. He expects the debt restructuring to be successful. He says Dubai and its leaders have too much to lose to let creditors, like banks in Britain, suffer losses. Still, the announcement was a surprise. Now Dubai World is faced with selling properties at heavy losses to raise money. Some experts question how willing Abu Dhabi will be to rescue Dubai. Their relationship is sometimes tense. Giath Naqshbandi says Dubai World will have to change its ways. He says Dubai borrowed too much money in a very short period of time. Of course, Dubai was not alone in gathering debt during the easy credit years. There are worries that the crisis could be the first of more to come in other parts of the world. And that's the VOA Special English Economics Report.
From VOA Learning English, welcome to Economic News in Special English. Economic growth in East Asia and the Pacific region is expected to reach 7.9% this year. That is higher than in any other part of the world. But that is only part of the story. The other side of East Asia's success includes conflicting territorial claims in the area and trade imbalances with the rest of the world. Competition for natural resources is an increasingly important issue. This has led to territorial disputes. For example, the islands known as Diaoyu in China and Senkaku in Japan are thought to be rich in oil. Areas around the islands are said to be good fishing grounds. China and Japan have competing claims for the territory. Kenneth Lieberthal is an Asia expert with the Brookings Institution here in Washington. He says he has not seen evidence that either China or Japan is willing to reduce tensions over the islands. That means territorial disputes will likely continue. China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and the Philippines are involved in territorial claims with neighbors over West Pacific islands. Trade imbalances are another issue. East Asia has long been a source of exports. China's big trade imbalance with the United States has concerned U.S. lawmakers for years. Some blame China's control of its currency for America's big trade deficit, but Kenneth Lieberthal does not think so. He notes other policies. One is China's direct support for many of its important industries with government aid or subsidies. Mr. Lieberthal says Chinese rules at home also hurt countries seeking to export to China. He says these and other issues, such as the abuse of intellectual property rights, have a much bigger effect on America's trade deficit with China. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. Economic concerns have been at the heart of the recent protests in Brazil. Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff answered growing public unrest over government spending and economic concerns. On June 24th, she proposed a popular vote or plebiscite on a constitutional process to make reforms needed by the country. President Rousseff also described a $23 billion spending plan. The money would go to public transportation and would support investment in education and health care. The Brazilian leader also promised to fight political corruption. President Rousseff met with state governors, city mayors, and protest leaders in the capital, Brasilia. It is estimated that 1 million people took part in protests across Brazil. Demonstrators are angry that the government is spending billions of dollars in public money in preparations for two huge sporting events. Brazil will hold the FIFA World Cup Soccer Championship next year, and then the 2016 Olympic Games 2 years later. The protests started when the government announced it would increase transportation costs, such as bus and subway fares. But the protests soon turned to other economic issues and spread. As a result, the government suspended its plans for the transportation fare increases. Demonstrators have been demanding better health care, education, and public transportation, and action against corruption. As Brazil prepares for the major sporting events, the country is also facing rising inflation. The inflation rate is now over 6%, which is higher than the government's target. For VOA Learning English, I'm Mario Ritter.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report in Special English. Burma's financial industry has suffered from years of mismanagement under military rule. But more recently, the government has pushed through economic reforms. those measures are changing the nation's banks and re-energizing businesses. There are even hopes that Burma could become one of Asia's fastest growing economies, an Asian tiger. Burma had one of the best performing economies in Southeast Asia before the military seized power in 1962. Many years of state control over the economy followed. Widespread corruption and international sanctions left it one of the poorest countries in the area. Economist Sean Turnell says turning around the economy will require strong measures against corruption. That is why he says political change is important to economic reform. He says restrictive measures make it harder for Burmese to do business internationally. The restrictions on foreign monetary exchange do not only hurt big business, they hurt small businesses too. Here is an example. Nini owns a workshop in Rangoon. He and his family manufacture toys for buyers from all over the world. His toy business is international, but Burma's banks are not. Nini still depends on middlemen called hundis to process foreign money transactions. Foreign visitors to Burma once used black market money changers, and hundis are still the main method for international monetary transfers. But the government hopes this unsupervised cash-based economy is ending. It plans to do this with new ATMs or automated teller machines and foreign exchange licenses for private banks. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Prasuti.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. Last week, we reported that international economists released a hopeful report about Africa's economy. The African Development Bank, the United Nations Development Program, and the OECD Development Center wrote the report. It predicts economic growth on the continent could reach 5 or 6% over the next 2 years. Economists expect 7% growth in West Africa's economy in the next 2 years. They say oil continues to be a major source of income, but that other industries are also important. Growth in Nigeria is coming from agriculture, trade and information, and communications technology. Manufacturing is helping Ghana grow. Sierra Leone is the fastest growing country in the area because of its iron ore exports, as well as its agriculture and building industries. In southern Africa, Angola, Mozambique, and Zambia are expected to grow between 5 and 7%. Labor problems and weak foreign export markets have affected growth in South Africa. But that country is still expected to grow almost 3% over the next 2 years. Angela Lusigi is an economist and policy advisor for the Regional Bureau for Africa in the UN Development Program. She says many countries are working to balance their budgets. And they have solid financial policies. She says the next question is how to make those improved policies result in growth that helps all of a country's citizens. She says inequality remains a big problem in Africa. Ms. Lusigi says it is important to have growth that affects all people and not just one group. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.